My name is Noreen Kawaja, and I'm a member of the Department of Religious Studies here at Yale. It's my delight and my honor to be have been asked to introduce Professor Doniger's second of 3 Terry lectures this evening. Before I say anything more, I just want to remind everyone, if they have not already, please turn off your cellular phones because this lecture is being recorded. And also another reminder that, as last time, after the lecture we'll have a reception where everyone is welcome, and it's just through those doors to the right there. Wendy Doniger is the Mircea Eliade Distinguished Service Professor of the History of Religions in the Divinity School at the University of Chicago. Dale Martin, my colleague, last time introduced Professor Doniger and gave us a great sense of her considerable achievements and her range as a scholar. To the many publications and honors he listed, I thought I'd just mention a few of the many awards she's received over the course of her career. She was the recipient of the Martin E. Marty Award for the Public Understanding of Religion given by the American Academy of Religion. She was given the Distinguished Scholar Award by the South Asian Literary Association. And she will deliver the Haskins Prize Lectures at the American Council of Learned Societies next year, an honor that celebrates the distinction and impact of her long scholarly career. Professor Doniger was also the recipient, in a slightly different vein, in 2012 of the University of Chicago's Faculty Award for Excellence in Graduate Teaching and Mentoring, their highest teaching award. And a factor in this achievement, I would guess, is the fact, which I've just learned, that she's advised 74 doctoral dissertations over the course of her career. 74 that finished, and I should say 74 and counting, right? So, on that note, I myself first read her work in my first year of graduate school in the context of a required seminar on theories and methods in the study of religion. And like most courses of this type, this one struggled to bridge the theoretical interests among a cohort of students whose fields ranged from Japanese Buddhism to German Protestantism, Orthodox Jewish theology to medieval Sufi rituals. And the greatest challenge was getting everyone in the room to care about the same books. But when we got to Doniger's 1999 book on myth, The Implied Spider, something changed. People started arguing and giving speeches. They also started thinking in class. Somehow Doniger's work spoke to a room of budding scholars who had been poised to think that the texts that we were reading had no bearing on their very specialized research. And her work turned those disengaged skeptics into fierce readers whose investment in the sorts of mythologies she was describing surprised even them. One of the reasons for this reaction, I'd venture to say, lay in Doniger's incomparable sensitivity to the metaphorical character of texts, her way of thinking in and through stories, telling stories about ideas, and often very unexpected stories. Every metaphor, she would be the first to remind us, involves the transgressing of a boundary, taking some meaning or image and carrying it over into a new space. We saw a good deal of this metaphorical thinking last time as we heard about the CIA agents of the Arthashastra, and perhaps more extensively about how the dharmic ideals of duty and justice were appropriated and transformed by the writers of the Kama Sutra and the Arthashastra. As we saw how in the interplay of duty and desire, competition and deception, love and political gain, these scriptures, which might be seen as separate and complementary, show themselves to cultivate nuanced and complex attitudes towards one another and towards the diverse goods that they seek. Professor Doniger has promised us that today things are going to get even more interesting, so without further ado, let's get to it. Welcome back. Today's topic is glossing Anti-Dharma with Dharma.
I want a copy of that. That's so good. Thank you, Noreen, for summarizing. It's always tricky to know who heard the first one 2 days ago. But for those of you who didn't, that was a very, very good summary of what I tried to do. Tried to do all my life, but also tried to do on Tuesday. So I'll take it from there, and I'll just summarize very little. We saw in my first lecture that someone added bits of the laws of Manu to the textbook of politics, the Arthashastra, and vice versa, and that the Kama Sutra, the text of erotic love, borrowed heavily from the Arthashastra. So we have these 3 texts in conversation. This sort of historical conflation is a common phenomenon among ancient Indian texts, whose robust intertextuality allows them to grow over the centuries like palimpsests, and it often leads to apparent internal dissonance. There are already contradictions within the laws of Manu that have nothing to do with the Arthashastra, as when Manu speaks both in favor of and against eating meat, and more broadly in favor of both animal sacrifice and non-injury to animals. And the influence of Manu on the Arthashastra and the Arthashastra on the Kama Sutra can account for some of the conflations of diametrically opposed points of view in the Arthashastra and the Kama Sutra that we will consider in this second lecture. Since many ideas taken from Manu were eventually stitched into the Arthashastra, some, but not all, of the bits of pro-Brahmin, pro-Dharmic ideology in the Arthashastra may be attributed to that revision. The Arthashastra, you should have a handout sheet of terms. Really, the only new one today is at the very bottom. I'll be talking about the Purva Paksha a lot, but the rest of them I'll skip over today. They're mainly from, I did them mostly on Tuesday. The Arthashastra and the Kama Sutra often cite the views of older scholars to contrast with their own views, and they do it in a particular way that is part of the convention of the game of Shastras, scientific textbooks. It's the custom in the Shastra tradition to cite the opponent's opinion first, known as the prior faction, the Purva Paksha. Paksha is actually a wing, and it's like right wing and left wing in British Parliament and in our politics. And Purva means the one that comes first. So the Purva Paksha is the prior faction, and they'll cite that often without explicitly noting that it is, in the author's view, incorrect, and then to state the author's own correct opinion, setting up opponents as straw men and then demolishing them. Both Kautilya, the author of the Arthashastra, and Vatsyayana, the author of the Kama Sutra, will also sometimes quote older scholars or opposing schools in order to say rather extreme things that they really believe themselves but do not want to own as their own, to get them on the table and then say, oh no, don't do that, in much the manner that a lawyer might reveal evidence to a jury and then, when reprimanded by a judge, say, the jury will disregard those remarks. It's not always easy to tell apart these two agendas, setting up straw men to demolish and using stalking horses to say what you yourself do not dare to say outright, since they both take the same form of ostensible disagreement. The Purva Paksha technique thus serves the Arthashastra and the Kama Sutra as a very useful way of challenging Dharma without seeming to challenge it. For example, the Arthashastra cites and dismisses the opinion of earlier scholars on the way to deal with the king's potentially patricidal sons as soon as they're born, starting from the suggestion that the king kill them at birth and concluding with the suggestion that he have them corrupted or addicted by pleasures. Kautilya lets the scholars quarrel among themselves, and then, having put on the table, in the mouths of other people, a number of truly diabolical suggestions that may never have occurred to anyone but Kautilya, he caps the argument with his own less violent, though still rather heartless advice, quote, if he's an only son who is dear to him, the king should imprison him. If he has many sons, the king should banish him to the frontier or to another region. That's as good as it gets for the crown prince. The word for scholars, acharyas, generally a term of great respect in ancient India, and the word normally used to designate previous authorities within the tradition that one is writing about, that word, scholars, is mocked in the Arthashastra when Kautilya objects to a ludicrous rule attributed to scholars, calling it mere wordplay. The word scholars almost has the pejorative tone in the Kama Sutra, perhaps best translated as pedants. The Kama Sutra cites its standard list of scholars in a debate about whether or not women have orgasms as men do, presenting the cockamamie theory of two earlier scholars, such as that women don't have orgasms but have worms inside them that produce an itch that demands to be scratched, before stating and defending against objections by several interlocutors, Vatsyayana's own sensible opinion that they do have orgasms like those of men. 2 chapters later, he states, Vatsyayana says, that is to say, I say, since learned men disagree and there are discrepancies in what the Dharma texts say, one should act according to the custom of the region and one's own disposition and confidence. Note Vatsyayana's casual scorn for the texts of Dharma and his awareness of their self-contradiction, as well as his preference for individual conscience. These scholars, thus, have many uses. By situating his text as merely a compilation of previous works, Vatsyayana creates and then fully utilizes a potential space for free discourse and frank commentary on the art and science of pleasure, largely devoid of the oppressive overlay of Dharma. In order to understand precisely how the Arthashastra and Kama Sutra got away with this agenda, it's useful to make a distinction between 2 aspects of religion: orthodoxy, believing the right thing, and orthopraxy, doing the right thing. Though the categories are rather crude and there are exceptions, in general, Hinduism during the period in question was far more orthoprax than orthodox. Dharma regulated the way people behaved, particularly toward Brahmins and toward members of each caste, more than what they believed in, particularly with regard to the gods. The Oxford English Dictionary defines blasphemy as A, profane speaking of God, or B, sacred things, or C, impious irreverence. The ancient Indians had no concept of blasphemy in the sense of A, profane speaking of God, which is primarily a monotheistic hang-up. With so many gods, one could not help preferring one to another, and therefore inevitably slighting some god or other. And it did not matter if you insulted gods who made no claim to omnipotence or omniscience, and certainly not to benevolence. This changed in the later period, the Bhakti period, when parts of Hinduism behaved a lot more like monotheistic religions. But I'm talking now of the early centuries CE and the last centuries BCE, and at this period, I think we really don't have the same problems that arise with Bhakti later on. We can talk about that. But at this time, and for most Hindus even later, blasphemy in the sense of B, profaning sacred things, such as the Veda, the most ancient and sacred text of Hinduism, and C, impious irreverence to the Brahmins, the custodians of the Veda, was indeed a problem. So you don't have the first kind of blasphemy, but you do have the second and third kind. Adharma, non-dharma, or anti-dharma, we can call it undharma, the opposite of dharma, is not type 1 blasphemy, which no one really cared about. Undharma means 2 and 3, not behaving properly, offending the Vedas and or Brahmins, and you could get into big trouble for that. The Arthashastra and Kama Sutra, therefore, were able quite confidently to get away with what non-Hindus might regard as blasphemous attitudes to the Hindu gods, but they were far more circumspect in what they said about Brahmins. And this is something I'll return to in the final lecture. For instance, Manu, the lawmaker, does not mention any punishment for verbal abuse of the gods, but he prescribes serious fines for the verbal abuse of Brahmins, depending upon the class of the offender, higher fines for the lower classes. And he continues, quote, "If a man of low birth hurls cruel words at a Brahmin, his tongue should be cut out. If he mentions his name or caste maliciously, a red-hot iron nail 10 fingers long should be thrust into his mouth. If he is so proud as to instruct Brahmins about their duty, the king should have hot oil poured into his mouth and ears." End quote. The Arthashastra is far more lenient than this in its prosecution for verbal abuse. The Arthashastra prescribes for all classes, unlike Manu, who discriminates sharply between them, fines but no physical punishment. For for, quote, insults relating to body, character, learning, occupation, and country, for an insult relating to the body with words such as one-eyed and lame, and the fine is doubled if the insult is untrue, a circumstance which Manu does not take into consideration at all. The Arthashastra also prescribes fines for disdain couched as praise of people who are one-eyed, lame, and the like, saying, what beautiful eyes you have, and for referring to people as lepers, insane, or impotent. But the Arthashastra occasionally does take class into account. These fines are doubled if the insult is directed at superiors, and it is halved if directed at inferiors or done through negligence, intoxication, or folly. When someone of a lower caste insults the character of someone higher, such as by saying vile Brahmin, this is the example of the Arthashastra, the fine is incrementally increased depending on the degree of difference between the classes. And when someone higher insults someone lower, it decreases depending on the degree of difference. The Arthashastra also prescribes fines for insults relating to the learning of bards and the occupation of artisans and performers, whom Manu, if you recall from the first lecture, regards as uninsultable or liable proof, being themselves a blot on the social landscape. The Arthashastra and the Kama Sutra, therefore, had to tread lightly in their critique of Dharma in what they said. We're talking now about words. In what they said about Brahmins and the Brahmin occupation of performing religious rituals. Under the circumstance, it is amazing that these two texts said as much as they did. The Kama Sutra in particular managed a brilliant end run around Dharma. How did they do it? Their subversion of Dharma managed to lodge in the body of normative texts an antinomian tradition, a pervasive undharmic agenda coated with a thin veneer of Dharma. The worlds imagined in the Arthashastra and the Kama Sutra largely disregarded rather than challenged the power of Brahmins. The texts were perpetuated by Brahmins. No one else wrote Sanskrit texts, under the noses of other, more conventional, traditional, uptight Brahmins. This was no class struggle. These texts, therefore, had a very limited direct effect on the actual lives of most people in ancient India, though they are highly significant in their implications for freedom of speech for intellectuals. But as we've seen in the first lecture, their indirect effect may well have been widely diffused through the general population, that is, the way that Sanskrit texts were translated orally and spread throughout the population. To this degree, they represent what James Scott of this great institution has taught us to call a hidden subversive transcript, one of the arts of resistance, a form of soft power, getting people to do what you want without a fight. The art that the Arthashastra and the Kama Sutra used somewhat resembles the technique that Hollywood producers adopted to get around the strict moral code, the so-called motion picture production code, enforced by the Hays Office from 1930 to 1968. In the 1946 film The Postman Always Rings Twice, for example, Lana Turner and John Garfield seem to succeed in committing both murder and adultery, which are forbidden in the Hays Office, until at the very last minute, as they're driving off into what appears to be a beautiful sunset, he loses control of the car while kissing her and drives into a tree, gratuitously and meaninglessly killing her. In Ocean's 11, 1960, Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack execute a brilliant and entirely successful robbery of the Las Vegas casinos, only to watch at the last minute all their money get burnt up in an incinerated coffin. Such tacked-on endings allowed Hollywood to violate the Hays Office code against successful adultery, successful murder in the body of the movie. Similarly, both the Arthashastra and the Kama Sutra pretend to care about Dharma and pay lip service to it at the start and finish of the book, like bookends, ranking it above Artha and Kama. We saw that in the first lecture. But on almost every page of the text, they violate Dharma, the Arthashastra by advocating violence and trickery, the Kama Sutra by facilitating adultery. Let's consider first the Arthashastra and then the Kama Sutra, in both cases noting first the superficial nod to Dharma and then the more substantial subversion of Dharma. The Arthashastra is careful to say a great deal in defense of Dharma. Right at the start, the text devotes an entire, if rather short, chapter to Dharma, including the laws for the four social classes, the general moral law that applies to everyone, and the particular moral law that applies to particular castes. Much of this reads as if it could have been taken more or less straight out of Manu, simply putting Manu's verse into prose. And in dealing with the crown prince, Kautilya remarks, one should teach him what accords with Dharma and Artha, never anything that is contrary to Dharma and Artha. Dharmic advice of this sort related to the control of the social community is scattered throughout the Arthashastra. Nonviolence is part of the Dharma of everyone. Performing your own caste Dharma gets you to heaven, and so forth. But many of the pro-Dharma statements in the Arthashastra are lodged in verses at the end of chapters, which appear to be tacked on as an afterthought, though they may in fact be taken from earlier pro-Dharma texts. Just as the statements in praise of the triple set, the three aims of human life, privileging Dharma, are tacked on in the start and finish of the text as a whole. And highly disrespectful attitudes to social Dharma and to the gods persist throughout the presumably old, pre-Manu, undharmic Arthashastra material. Amartya Sen regards the Arthashastra as, quote, basically a secular treatise despite the respectful gestures it makes to religious and social customs, end quote. We've considered these respectful gestures to Dharma, that is to say, religious and social customs, but to the extent that undharma can be translated as secularity, we might ask, what then not only makes this text secular, but justifies Sen's view that it is a bulwark against religiosity and one of the pillars of, quote, the reach of public reasoning in India and the diversity of its coverage, end quote. The evidence for the secularity of the Arthashastra is profuse and profound. The king's education, after a brief nod to the Vedas, was entirely secular and scientific, not religious. Nor does the Arthashastra always treat Brahmins with the great respect that Manu demands for them. When a Brahmin commits a crime, the king should proclaim it, scar him with a mark, and exile him. So Brahmins were not, in theory at least, entirely immune to punishment. In replenishing the treasury, the king's officers, quote, should bring over the property of religious orders or the property of temples, except what is meant for use by Vedic scholars, stating that it was deposited with the person who has died or whose house has been burnt down. The temple superintendent should gather individually the treasures belonging to the temples of the city and bring them over in the same manner, end quote. The king could therefore confiscate religious property, and he was told to lie when he wanted to do it. But he did make a point of leaving Vedic scholars alone, so he's walking this tightrope. A truly appalling subversion of Dharma in the Arthashastra occurs in one of the tests that, as we saw in the first lecture, the king is told to use to choose his ministers. The test for Dharma is a test against Dharma, a test to make sure that this minister is impervious to Dharma. It begins when the king gets his chaplain to pretend to object to an order given by the king in violation of Dharma. Then, quote, the king should then pretend to dismiss him. He should send secret agents to instigate each minister that's being tested, instigate each minister individually under oath, saying, this king is undharmic. Come on, let's install in his place some other dharmic person. Everyone likes this idea. What about you? If he rebuffs it, he is a man of integrity. That is the secret test relating to Dharma, end quote. In other words, you want your chaplain, your chief priest, the person in charge of the Dharma of the entire kingdom, to be someone who doesn't care about Dharma as much as he cares about loyalty to the king. Other officials, too, in the Arthashastra might cause a loss of revenue if they hesitate to act against Dharma. You want officials who are impervious to moral principles of any kind. Another way in which the Arthashastra seriously undermines Dharma is in the widespread use of ascetics, both male and female, as spies, or the use of spies who pretend to be ascetics. It's never entirely clear which. Either the king bribes and corrupts genuine renouncers, or by getting his agents to impersonate such people, he sullies the reputation of the real ones. Renouncers and yogis and ascetic magicians already had a fairly dicey reputation in ancient India, and the Arthashastra made a bad situation even worse. The basic orthopraxy of Hinduism makes offenses against the gods far less important than offenses against Brahmins. Yet all three of our texts sometimes act as if they believe in the gods, although their attitudes to them differ widely. For instance, on several occasions, Manu mentions Indra, the Vedic king of the gods, as a great god worthy of worship, and tells the king to emulate him. The Arthashastra and Kama Sutra, by contrast, tell the tale of Indra's punishment for adultery as a cautionary tale, a way that the king should not behave. And the Arthashastra and Kama Sutra seem to have no sense of divine sanctions for the rules that they break in such a cavalier manner. Where lack of respect for gods blends over into the area of lack of concern for sacrifice or temple rituals, however, the Arthashastra once again comes into direct conflict with Dharma. Take the question of the divine nature of the king. Manu basically argues that the king is a god and you should obey him. Quote, even a boy king should not be treated with disrespect with the thought he is just a human being, for this is a great deity standing there in the form of a man, end quote. And to support this statement, Manu tells the myth of the origin of the first king created to save the world from the chaos of anarchy. In return for his protection, the people agreed to pay him 1/6 of their produce in taxes. Kautilya quotes this same myth of anarchy, but cynically, instructing the king to have his spies spread the story among the people to shut down dissent, to make them fear the king and pay their taxes, manipulating the myth of primeval anarchy in order to control the gullible. We noted in the first lecture the Arthashastra's use of actors. In one noteworthy passage, spies dress as gods of fire and water to demoralize the enemy during a siege. Quote, the king, when he desires to capture an enemy settlement, should embolden his own faction and terrify his enemy's faction by proclaiming his omniscience and his intimacy with gods. The proclamation of intimacy with gods, however, is as follows. Conversing with and worshiping agents posing as gods of a fire sanctuary, agents who have entered the hollows of divine statues in the fire sanctuary through an underground tunnel, or conversing with and worshiping agents disguised as Nagas, serpent deities, and Varuna, god of the waters, emerging from water. This sort of divine impersonation was used on other occasions too. When trying to raise more money after stealing from the temples, the king could play theological tricks of his own. Quote, having erected a divine shrine or a holy place of a magician at night, claiming that it arose spontaneously, he should make a living through pilgrimages and fairs. Or he should publicize the advent of a divinity via a tree in a sanctuary bearing flowers and fruit out of season. Or, after disclosing the danger of a demon in a tree demanding a human being as a tax, agents working undercover as ascetics should counteract it for the people of the city and countryside in exchange for money. Or, for a monetary gift, he should show a snake with several heads in a well equipped with an underground tunnel. He should show to credulous people the sight of a snake put into a trance with food in a snake statue containing a cavity within it, or in a hole of a sanctuary. Or he should replenish the treasury by counteracting occult appearances. And if there's anyone who is not taken in by these tricks, the king can always fall back upon the usual solution. Quote, in the case of those who are not credulous, after administering poison to them when they are sipping water or washing, he should declare it to be a curse of the deity, end quote. There are lots of these. How could a king who believed in the gods consent to mock them in such ways as this? And it gets worse. The statues of gods come in handy as murder weapons. First, they are used merely to demoralize the enemy. Quote, "From highly honored statues of gods, they should cause an excessive flow of blood. Then others should say that the flow of God's blood predicts defeat in a war." End quote. But then they're actually used to kill. Quote, "During the pilgrimage for worshiping a divinity, there are numerous places that the enemy will visit to pay homage according to his devotion. At these places, the king should employ trickery upon him. Upon him, as he enters a temple, he should make a false well or a stone fall by releasing a mechanical device, or set off a shower of stones or weapons from an upper chamber, or let a door panel plunge, or release a door bar attached to a wall and secured at one end, or he should make the statue, banner, or weapons of the god fall upon him." End quote. This scenario, straight out of Indiana Jones in the Temple of Doom, is also attributed to Hero of Alexander in the 1st or 2nd century CE, who made the same sort of machines to trick people. And in the Arabian Nights, a pagan king employs a man to slip inside the idol and give out the oracles from within the statue. But apparently, unlike the king in the Arthashastra, the pagan king does not use the idol to kill the supplicants. What about the Kama Sutra? Vatsyayana offers a defense of Dharma against imagined materialists, whose arguments he states in the usable Purvapaksha. Remember, that's the wrong argument, and then rebuts. So he first quotes materialists and then defends Dharma against them. So the materialists have said Dharma is no good, and then he answers in rebuttal, "People should act within Dharma because the text cannot be doubted, because sometimes black magic and curses are seen to bear fruit, because the constellations, moon, sun, stars, and the circle of the planets are seen to act for the sake of the world as if they thought about it first, because social life is marked by the stability of the system of the 4 classes and the 4 stages of life, and because people are seen to cast away a seed in their hand for the sake of a crop in the future." End quote. So perhaps by positioning himself as a stout defender of the stability of the system of the 4 classes, Vatsyayana is subtly seeking the support of the religious and secular critics of his work and undermining their criticism of a text dedicated to pleasure. The Kama Sutra at the very start nods to Dharma as it introduces its section on the women with whom one should and should not have sex. Quote, "Kama enjoyed according to the texts with a woman who is of the man's own class and who has not been with another man before is a means of getting sons, a good reputation, and social acceptance. But," that "but" in the first sentence introduces a long, long list of other sorts of women that one may enjoy if one is not particularly concerned about class, sons, reputation, or social acceptance. Indeed, it introduces the entire rest of the text. One of the rationalizations for having sex with a woman from the category one should not have usually takes Dharma into consideration. The man may, this is quote, "The man may think, this is a loose woman. She's already ruined her virtue with many other men. Even though she is of a class higher than mine, I can go to her as I would go to a courtesan without offending against Dharma. She's a second-hand woman. Since another man has kept her before me, there's no reason to hesitate about this. For these and similar reasons, one may seduce even the wife of another man." End quote. So the danger of offending against Dharma and the issue of class is considered but quickly rationalized away. References to Dharma in the Kama Sutra, though relatively rare, sometimes occur in surprising contexts. This is one of my favorite ones. The courtesan wonders, "Will I serve Dharma or violate it if I go, on the sympathetic advice of a friend, to a Brahmin who knows the Veda, or to a man who's under a vow of chastity or consecrated for a sacrifice, or a man who has taken a vow of chastity, or who wears the sign of a religious order, if he has seen me and conceived a passion for me and wants to die if I don't come to him. End quote. In other words, she would violate Dharma in one way if she allowed or helped a man of chastity to violate his vows, but she would violate it in another way if she let him die through his unsatisfied passion for her. She is caught between a rock and a hard place. The Kama Sutra elsewhere remarks that when a man sees that his desire is progressing from one stage to the next, then in order to ward off these fatal blows to his own body, he should make advances to other men's wives. This escape clause apparently also applies to men under religious vows. Dharma slips in another unexpected spot, too, in the Kama Sutra. In listing the reasons why a married woman might resist our hero's invitation to betray her husband, one of the scholars, right, we're in the Purva Paksha now, the other guys, says, a woman does not consider Dharma or undharma, she just desires. But consideration of some other factor keeps her from making advances. A man, by contrast, considers the stability of Dharma and the conventions of noble people and turns back even when he desires. And even when he is pursued, he does not give in because he is aware of these considerations. Mind you, Vatsyayana by no means necessarily agrees with this view, which in any case merely tells us what people do, not what they ought to do. But Vatsyayana himself contradicts at least the first sentence, a woman does not consider Dharma, when he lists as the very last in a long list of the causes of a woman's resistance, the possibility that she has regard for Dharma. In contrast with these few scattered, ambiguous, positive references to Dharma, the Kama Sutra, by endorsing adultery in an entire book of the 7 books devoted to it, is undermining the very basis of the social system, and that's where it is truly bold. Moreover, where the Arthashastra constantly upholds the systems of both caste and class, which are at the heart of the social law advocated in the Dharma text, the Kama Sutra, in contrast with almost all other shastras of this period, largely ignores caste and class. There are only 4 references to class in the whole book, all peripheral. We've already seen 2 of them in this consideration of women of the same class. The Kama Sutra portrays an idealized form of the actual lives of wealthy people who did not necessarily follow the rules of Dharma. In defending the need for a Kama Sutra, Vatsyayana says, scholars say, remember, this is other guys, pedants. Pedants say, quote, since even animals manage sex by themselves, and since it goes on all the time, it should not have to be handled with the help of a text. So this is an argument, why read the Kama Sutra? Vatsyayana says, because a man and a woman depend upon one another in sex, it requires a method, and this method is learned from the Kama Sutra. The mating of animals, by contrast, is not based on any method, because they mate only when the females are in their fertile season and until they achieve their goal, and they act without thinking about it first. End quote. Thus, Vatsyayana dismisses with 1 or 2 short sentences the scholar's dharmic assumption that the purpose of the sexual act is to produce children. Given the enormous emphasis that the Dharma texts place on having sex only to produce children, and Manu's insistence that a man must have sex with his wife in her every fertile season and never at any other time, which the Arthashastra echoes and agrees with, the Kama Sutra's assumption that people differ from animals precisely in their ability to have sex separate from fertility is wildly anti-dharmic and highly scientific. But the most dramatic instance of the irrelevance of Dharma for the Kama Sutra comes when the Kama Sutra actually defines Dharma. It says, Dharma consists in engaging, as the texts decree, in sacrifice and other such actions that are disengaged from material life because they're not of this world and their results are invisible. And Dharma consists in refraining, as the texts agree, from eating meat and other such actions that are engaged in material life because they are of this world and the results are visible, end quote. But Vajrayana here totally dismisses the role of Dharma in this world, a role that, as we've seen, he cites with approbation in his defense of Dharma just a few lines later, quote, because social life is marked by the stability of the system of the four classes and the four stages of life. Ignoring Manu's Dharma, the social aspect of Dharma, the Dharma of what you should eat and whom you should marry, but Vajrayana here seems to confuse it with theology or philosophy. Yet in his earlier defense of Dharma, his approval of doing something for the sake of what you can't see, sowing seeds for the future, is an affirmation of the otherworldly aspects of Dharma. But it is in the casual suggestions that pervade the book that we can best see the Kama Sutra's total disregard for Dharma. Vajrayana cites an earlier authority on the best places to pick up married women, of which the first is on the occasion of visiting the gods, and others include a sacrifice, a wedding, or a religious festival. Somehow I don't think Manu would approve of the man in question meeting married women at all, let alone using devotion to the gods as an occasion for it. In general, the Kama Sutra assumes a kind of sexual freedom for women that would have appalled Manu, but simply does not interest Kautilya. But Vajrayana tells us that a woman who does not experience the pleasures of love may hate her man and leave him for another. If, as the context suggests, this woman is married, the casual manner in which Vajrayana suggests that she leave her husband is in sharp contrast to the position assumed by Manu, quote, a virtuous wife should constantly serve her husband like a god, even if he behaves badly, freely indulges his lust, and is devoid of any good qualities, end quote. But Vajrayana casually mentions, among the women one might sleep with, not only second-hand women, but widows whom Manu positively forbids to remarry. The Kama Sutra says, quote, a widow who is tormented by the weakness of the senses finds again a man who enjoys life and is well endowed with good qualities, end quote. Having left the guy who had no qualities at all. In Manu and the Arthashastra, male homoerotic activity was punished, albeit mildly. A ritual bath, according to Manu, or the payment of a small fine, according to the Arthashastra. The Arthashastra specifies punishments for a man who has sex with a female wandering ascetic, or with a prostitute by force, or with a woman in a place other than the vagina, or for ejaculating in a man or in the vaginas of animals, or for many men raping a single prostitute. Manu forbids a man to shed his semen in non-human females, in a man, in menstruating women, in something other than a vagina, or in water. The Kama Sutra ignores some of these acts and regards others as non-criminal, though in bad taste. But it departs from the Dharmic view of homosexuality in significant ways, principally by not regarding it as a crime at all. In place of the conventional law against sex between men, it describes in totally non-judgmental language two types of men who make their living performing oral sex on other men. One is a cross-dressing male with stereotypical female gender behavior. The other, a closeted man who dresses in man's clothing and whose fellatio technique the Kama Sutra describes in considerable sensual detail in the longest consecutive passage in the text describing any physical act, and with what might even be called gusto. The Kama Sutra also describes men who engage in oral sex not by profession but out of love, who seem bound to one another by discriminating affection rather than promiscuous passion. Nowhere else in the entire corpus of ancient Sanskrit literature is there a positive portrayal of men who have sex with men. But the most significant divergence between the two texts, Arthashastra and Kama Sutra, on the subject of sexuality is their attitude to adultery. Manu tells you to kill the adulteress. The Arthashastra tells you to forgive her or mutilate her, and the Kama Sutra to find a way to get her to go to bed with you. More precisely, the Arthashastra regards adultery as a legal crime, as does Manu, although the Arthashastra goes into far more detail than Manu when it comes to the punishment of the adulterous couple. Manu says, if a woman who is proud of her relatives of her own qualities deceives her husband with another man, the king should have her eaten by dogs in a place frequented by many people. And he should have the evil man burnt on a red-hot iron bed, and people should pile wood on it, and the evildoer should be burnt up, end quote. The Arthashastra is more lenient, quote, if the husband were to forgive her, both the woman and her lover should be set free. If she is not forgiven, the woman's ears and nose should be cut off, and her paramour shall be put to death. None of this is in the Kama Sutra, which devotes an entire whole book, Book 5, to minute and psychologically acute instructions to the man who wishes to commit adultery, detailing hundreds of stratagems by which the man about town may sleep with the wives of other men, and it merely pulls back at the very end with a Hayes office warning to the man not to do it and to guard his own wife. Let's look at that passage. So after telling you chapter after chapter, make sure the husband's out of town, all that kind of stuff. And at the end he says, in verse, a man who knows texts and considers from the text the devices whose telltale signs are detailed in the discussion of the seduction of other men's wives is never deceived by his own wives. But he himself should never seduce other men's wives, because these techniques show only one of the two sides of each case, because the dangers are clearly visible, and because it goes against both Dharma and Artha. This book was undertaken in order to guard wives for the benefit of men. Its arrangements should not be learned in order to corrupt the people, end quote. Yeah, sure. But Vajrayana manifests his ambivalence about sexual freedom at many points in his book, particularly in the verses at the end of each chapter, which often raise doubts about matters that he has recommended in the prose passages. Which one expresses Vajrayana's own opinion? We've noted in the Kama Sutra and Arthashastra the tension between Dharma and Undharma. But the Kama Sutra has a third factor to take into account. The first level, the bulk of the work, is in prose, describing all the things that a person could possibly do. Many of these, such as adultery and homosexuality, violate Dharma. But Vajrayana seems to feel duty-bound to mention them in order to cover the full spectrum of possibilities, as befits a Shastra, a genre that boasts of totality. Let's say more about that. You're supposed to cover the whole subject in a Shastra. So Vajrayana tells you everything he's ever heard of that people could do sexually. The second level, in verse, at the end of chapters, insists on the rules of Dharma. But there's also a third level on which Vajrayana seems to be expressing his personal distaste for certain actions, regardless of their dharmic or undharmic status. Sometimes he says that such things are done in the south. Vajrayana probably came from Pataliputra in the north. Sometimes he says that only country folk will do them, never sophisticated cosmopolitans. And sometimes he simply falls back upon a kind of dharma of individualism. Listen to your own conscience. Don't just do what the text says, and always have a care for your partner's individual tastes and physical capacities. It is on this third level, outside the scope of Dharma and Undharma, that Vajrayana seems most secular and most rational. Thus, in conclusion, free and unfettered discourse existed in this period in Indian history, primarily in the realm of Kama. In the third lecture next Wednesday, I'll explore another realm in which the secular tradition lived on, the much-quoted but perhaps non-existent set of people variously referred to as skeptics and materialists. The Arthashastra and Kama Sutra, with their near total disregard for Dharma, show a striking congruence with materialist assumptions. The Arthashastra cites with approval the so-called materialists, the Lokayatas, and who are frequently cited always with disapproval in later texts as well, including the Kama Sutra. To this extent, these Charvakas, as they're called, these materialists, carry on the legacy of the scientific Shastras, sniping away at Dharma. But did the Charvakas exist, or did they eventually become, whether or not they ever were real, a useful figment of the Hindu imagination, mythical strawmen that allow ancient texts to express skeptical ideas without taking responsibility for them? Come back on Wednesday and find out. Thank you.
Okay, the floor is now open for questions. While you're gathering your thoughts and getting ready, I should remind you that as with last time, there are 2 microphones on either side of the room, and it's really important that you approach the microphone and speak into it, as this lecture is being recorded. We want to hear your question and not only the answer. One final reminder, there will be a reception. Please join us. You're all very welcome after this talk, and as well as after the final talk on Wednesday, which will be back in the old room, that is in Luce Hall, also at 4:30. And as you ask your question, please introduce yourself. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Doniger. I'm Nikhil, and I attended your previous lecture where you mentioned that it was quite likely that a young courtier read the laws of Manu during the day and the Kama Sutra at night. But it really seems from this lecture that these 3 kind of addressed slightly different audiences. Or like someone who enjoyed reading Manu would find the Kama Sutra distasteful. So do you really think this happened? And if it did, how did people reconcile the 2 texts in their day-to-day life?
It's a good question. They are certainly addressed to different sorts of assumptions about the world. That is to say, laws of Manu assume that you're going to obey the rules and you're going to do the right thing, although Manu also says, if you don't obey the rules, this is what to do. So he knows that people do make mistakes. The Arthashastra is addressing the king, theoretically, and telling him how to run the country. And other people might read it as one would read a legal text to find lawyers, and the ancient Indian equivalent of people, the village panchayats, the people who decided legal cases. Is this woman have a right? Whose property is this? This guy says it's mine, and so forth. So that's who would primarily read the Arthashastra. The Kama Sutra would be read by people of leisure, people of privilege, people who are looking for ways to have a good time, and so forth. Of course, a lawyer could also have a good time. And someone who cared about Dharma could also care about law. So in a way, it's rather like, I would say, scientists, geologists who know about the history of planet Earth and how to date it, and who work all week at geology and paleographic materials, and go to church on Sunday and read the creation of the world in Genesis, and enjoy that too in a different way. So I think it's possible that there were different audiences, but it's also possible that a single person, certainly a scholar, might read all 3 texts out of interest. The other thing to say is, as in the passage, that really important passage in the Kama Sutra, about how even if you can't read Sanskrit, you might get to know the text in other ways. That's a really important text that I think is too often ignored. People say, oh, well, only Brahmins read Sanskrit, so this text is very elite, no one knew about it. Everybody knew about it. People in India, for instance, know the plot of the Ramayana. They don't read Valmiki's Sanskrit texts. So in the same way, these ideas are largely diffused. People know what Manu says. A lot of people hated Manu for what he said. Manu was burnt in the 19th century by all sorts of people because of the caste system. And people say, oh, the Arthashastra says, always kick a man when he's down, even if they haven't read the Sanskrit text. And people say the Kama Sutra says you can really do this and so forth, and you should chew betel after you make love and things like that. So in the broader sense, they were diffused promiscuously throughout society. And even in the Sanskrit sense, although they're addressed to different people in one way, the ideas are more broadly available. They conflict. But people do have conflicting ideas and wear different hats. So So I'm saying that they have very different ideas about Dharma, but at the same time, people have various ideas about Dharma. And it's quite conceivable that one person would read and enjoy in different ways all three texts. So it's a good question. Yes.
Hi. Thanks so much. My name is Seth. So I think that this is somewhat related to the last question. I'm very interested in all the examples that we've been hearing from the Arthashastra.
That's the best part.
Yeah. And I'm curious, it would seem, if these authors are writing this, that they had intended for these examples to be really, or say the tests in of a cleric or something like that in the Arthashastra. If that was presumably meant to be taken seriously, or if there's other literature around that is doing things like this and it's just a rhetorical device, that would be sort of the first question. So on the side of the authors, are these meant to be taken seriously? And then on the side of the audience, were they thought to be taken seriously? Or were they just rhetorical devices, perhaps, to the audience? Is there any way of knowing?
It's a really good and really unanswerable question. In some ways, all of these texts are highly idealized. If you read the Kama Sutra carefully, it tells you what you're supposed to do all day long. In the morning, this is the guy, right? In the morning he shaves, and then he has food brought to him, and then he trains his minor bird to speak. And in the afternoon, he goes on a picnic. And then in the evening, he goes to visit people. They play music and they dance. And you wonder, does he ever visit his mother? Does he ever what does he do about his stockbroker? If he's that kind of a guy, where is the rest of his life? It's sort of like the Playboy ideal, Hugh Hefner in the ancient world. So obviously, very few people ever actually lived like that. But those are all possibilities. Some people trained minor birds to sing, and some people had concerts at night. So it's kind of condensed into an idealized world. In the same way, my colleague Sudhir Kakar once figured out that Manu has so many rules about the days when you can't have sex with your wife that if you followed all the rules in Manu, so you can't have sex with your wife when she's not fertile, so that's just part of the month. You never, on the even days you get a daughter, you don't want a daughter, so you have sex on the odd days. You can't have sex in certain phases of the moon. He figured out you can have sex -7 days a month if you actually follow all the rules in Manu. So he's really saying you should try not to do this. So Manu is idealized. The Kama Sutra is idealized. The Arthashastra, I think, is idealized in a wicked way. No kings killed all their sons. I mean, that's an insane idea. You're worried about your son taking over when he grows up? Kill him. This is not good advice. This is the extreme form. So they're all, in some ways, pushing the envelope into extreme areas, but they show us what the ideals were, and the ideals are very important. So the ideal of the Kama Sutra was just have fun all the time. The ideal of Manu was always obey the rules all the time. The ideal of the Arthashastra was do anything at all to gain power. And that's what we get from them, really. The other thing to say is, besides the ideals, the details are really interesting. And the details have a feeling of realia to them. So when he describes the sorts of foods you're supposed to serve at a party when the courtesans come to visit you, you see what people ate. They had little bits of meat on sticks like you have as hors d'oeuvres and things like that. And he says after you make love, you shouldn't look at each other because you're all messed up. You go off to shower. And then when you come back, there are sort of nice things that probably happened. So there are a lot of really specific, I think, realia moments, but the overall picture of the text is idealized. And so you have to maneuver between those when you say, did people really do this or not? I think they did the specific things. I don't think they swallowed the whole ideal. That's my compromise answer. Anyway.
Thanks.
But it's a good question, and I'll say that. Seth, hello.
Hi, Wendy, good to see you again.
Good to see you
I'm Seth
too.
Sanders, and I actually think the first lecture I ever heard on religion was Dreams, Illusion, and Other Realities, which you gave in 7th grade. well, when I was in 7th grade, not
Seth
yet.
Seth went to school with my son, so we go way back.
So that description in the of all the stratagems to use and abuse gods in the Arthashastra struck me in some way as being like the story that Machiavelli tells about Manu's anagrammatic relative Numa in the Discourses on Livy. But of course, Machiavelli is doing that as part of a critique of religion and Christianity too. Are the things that the author of the Arthashastra says about the tricks you do with gods, do you think it implies that kind of a sweeping critique of religion, or is it something else?
That's a good question. I don't see it as a critique of religion. I see it as total disregard of religion. I mean, if you believed in a God, even if you believed that there might possibly be a God in that temple, would you really put a spy in it and have the statue thrown down on somebody? So that's the part of the Arthashastra that implies no belief in gods. There's another piece, there's a limit what you can do in one lecture, but in the book I'll talk about it more. He tells the king to indulge in sacrifice before a war. And obviously there are public sacrifices for the masses, right? And I could think of Monty Python, blessing the sacred grenades and all that sort of thing. But he also tells the king to have a private sacrifice. And the only way I can figure that it is either there is no privacy for a king, everybody knows that the king is privately praying now, or he's indulging in Pascal's wager. There just might be gods, so it doesn't hurt to hedge your bets and do a little bit of sacrificing. So there are these moments when it seems that he might think that there's a possibility that the gods exist, but most of it, you couldn't possibly do these things. Dress up as gods and have the guy walk around with the king? If you believe that there was Vishnu, he says Vishnu is an example. Would you have people dress as Vishnu if you believe that there was a Vishnu? So it seems to me it's just simply a disregard of the gods. The people are gullible, these idiots. They believe in gods. Okay, pretend there are gods for them. It just seems to me an extraordinarily cynical attitude toward religion in these tricks that he plays. Set up a guy in a tree, pretend there's human sacrifice, pretend there's a demon there. He's dealing with superstition, which he regards as merely superstition. And he blends it in. The thing about the God in the temple is in the same paragraph as pretend there's a God, a demon in the tree. He just thinks it's all stupidity. People are gullible, use religion. It's that attitude, I think. In that sense, it is a spectacular critique of religion. Only idiots believe there are gods.
Wow.
I mean, it just seems to me that way.
I think we have time for one last question. Somewhere on the right.
Yes, I was sort of concerned about this notion of the text being idealized. The Arthashastra and the Kama Sutra over centuries, just exist disembodied from any communities that's enlivened from any group of people, any power structures. That aspect of any social, rooting it in any social structures is just completely absent. So I wonder why you think you could do that.
Yeah. Let me answer that one first. I'm not saying it's idealized and that it was irrelevant to what people did. People read it and may have taken its advice. I simply say that and I say that's the reality, all right? There are all sorts of things in it that people really did. He tells you how to tax different, I've given you the creme de la creme of the Arthashastra. Most of it is extremely boring. It's long lists of how much you pay to go over a bridge if you have a four-wheeled cart, how much you pay to go over a bridge if you have an eight-wheeled cart, and so forth. And that sort of stuff, obviously, is part of rules of governing a kingdom. So there's a lot of it which was absolutely applied and used. He tells you the different oaths that you make people swear in court depending on their class. There's a lot of nitty-gritty useful stuff.
Yeah, I would say that...
I'm saying the extreme weird parts of kill your son and so forth like that are idealistic parts of it, where it's idealized a kind of pure self-serving materialism which I think cannot have been the rule.
I mean, it would seem to me certainly there's a Dharma for the king. The king can kill and punish, a lower class person cannot. So, you know, sort of subversive, non-dharmic texts covered by a thin veneer of Dharma for certain classes, but there are classes which have to toe the line and do the, you know, pay attention to the Dharma. So, you know, I find that sort of missing from your analysis about
the reality. Well, then I didn't
you know that they are. If the one might even be able to trace some of those rules. The second point I want to make, because I don't want to take too much time, and
let me answer that then. Okay, so it's idealized in another way. For instance, in Manu, one of the most serious crimes is a young male student seducing the guru's wife. Manu thinks this is a major crime in ancient India because it must have happened all the time, because you have all these old gurus with young wives who take young male students in, right? This is a formula for disaster. And so it is the defining crime, Guru Talpaga, going to the guru's bed. And so Manu says there are two possible punishments for it. One is, if you've committed the crime of sleeping with your guru's wife, you should castrate yourself and hold the severed testicles in your hand and walk to the northwest until you die. Or you can drink a mixture of cow's urine and several other things and fast for 3 days. Now, which one are you going to do, right? This is a no-brainer. Obviously, people who wanted to expiate the sin, it's like Hail Marys, the priest tells you what to do, would have drunk the lousy stuff. And the idea that you would castrate yourself and walk until you die is an idealized punishment. This is what should be really done to someone who does this terrible thing.
It might allow somebody in power to actually do that or force you to do it.
I think everybody just drank the cow urine, is what I think.
The other thing I'd like to mention is in Buddhist texts you have a lot of the same kind of things about what kings do, very bad things.
That's another world entirely.
Not at all. And one of the things it does is that it allows kings to behave badly.
Kings behave badly all the time. They have the power to do so. That's what it is to be king, is to have the power to behave badly.
And there's an idea in Buddhism that perhaps a king can never really be moral.
Well, let me answer that as the last question.
Yeah, that is going to be the last
one. Dumézil wrote about this years ago, and the Indian texts are very much aware of it. The king has the duty to punish. That's the most important thing a king does. Therefore, the king has to inflict capital punishment a great deal. Therefore, the king kills a great deal. And therefore, the king needs to have a powerful purohit, a powerful chaplain, at hand at all times. He has to be constantly restored from his state of pollution from doing his job as king. And there's a great deal of material throughout the Indo-European world. I think Georges Dumézil wrote about this as well as anybody else. And it's not just India, but it's very brilliantly developed in India, that the king must sin. The king is by definition a sinner because of the need to take life, and therefore he can only function in constant cooperation with the purohit, with the royal chaplain, who absolves him day after day so he can go on doing his job. So that's built into not only the Indian, but the pre-Indian, ancient Indo-European concept of kingship. So that too.
Please join me in giving our speaker a hand for this rousing lecture and question and answer.